First of all, this technique uses geometry nodes, and I'm assuming you already have some basic understanding of geometry nodes. If you don't, I think you should still be able to follow my steps and get the same result. Okay, let's get started. I'm gonna get rid of the default cube and the point light and expand this bottom part of the interface. I'm gonna add a Bezier curve to the scene. Now, let's go to the modifiers tab and add a geometry node modifier. Click New, create a new node. Okay, now let's add a resample curve node. This way, we will be able to modify the curve's resolution later in the process. Next step is to get the curve's factor. So let's add a capture attribute node and hook up a spline parameter node to it. We will need this in a minute. Now we will add some objects onto our curve. First, let's convert the curve to points, so the next node instance on points will have a proper input to work with. So I'm using a curve to points node, followed by instance on points node. Now let's add some geometry as our instances. I'll go with a cone, as later it will come in handy to show you how to align this geometry onto the path that it's following. We will need to scale down the instances a little bit just to see better the output of our whole setup. This looks good. Okay. To move our cones along the path, we would need to use the set position node. And it's going to be easier to move the points that are the source for the instances rather than the instances themselves. So let's put the set position node before instance on points node. Now we need to fill in the position sockets. We will use the spline factor attribute that we captured earlier. So add a sample curve node and hook up the attribute to the factor like this, and also geometry into the curves socket. Now hook up position to position like that. In order to move the points, we need to add something to their positions that are defined by their factor on the curve. A math node set to add will increase the factor of every point respectively, like this. But as you can see, when I add some values to our factor, the end result is that the factor becomes larger than 1, leaving our cones stuck at the end of the spline. What we want is that when each point on the spline exceeds the factor of 1, a value of 1 should be deducted from it, thus making it move onto the start of the spline again. To do that, let's add another math node and set it to wrap, with the max value set to 1 and the minimum value set to 0. Now, no matter what value we add here, this motion will loop. For this translation of the points, we can also add a scene time node, so we don't have to keyframe anything. This is a bit too fast, so I'm going to add another math node and multiply the value by 0.1. Well, we can also hook up the index node to the selection socket of the instance on points node. It's not mandatory. This setup should still work correctly without this, but it's getting rid of this weird overlapping geometry on one of the cones that you could probably see. Okay, now this looks good. Two more things we can do to make this motion more elegant. First, let's align these instances to the curve that they're following. To do that, we need to add a line Euler to vector node and hook up the tangent from the sample curve node to the vector input in the align Euler to vector node, and then connect the rotation to rotation from here to instance and points. As you can see, we can still edit the curve and the cones are following. And one last thing that I like to do is to fade in and fade out the instances in some way so they don't appear and disappear so suddenly. We could do this through material, giving the instances some alpha depending on their proximity to the start and the end of the curve. But let's stay within Geometry Node tab and just scale them instead. To do this, let's use a color ramp and hook up our spline factor attribute. But we need to use the one that's being modified by these math nodes. Now, hook up the color ramp to the scale and edit your gradient. Maybe like this, or however you like it. I start with a black, followed by white, and then also end with a black value, which will scale the instances to 0 basically. So we will have a nice fade in and fade out at the beginning and at the end of the spline. Since this whole setup is done in geometry nodes, we can always go back and tweak all the settings to our liking, the size of the cones, the number. I'm going to also hook up this input here, so it's easier to change the count of the cones later. I'm going to call it number of instances just so it's clear what this value does. And that's basically it. Here's the whole setup. If you want to pause the video right now and just recreate it on your own,